Hey guys, welcome everybody to yet another Saving Elephants live stream. It's good to have you join us today. I have yet another excellent group of panelists to discuss a very important and, in my view, under-discussed issue, federalism. What is it and how might it help our political discourse? I'm going to bring on our panelists one at a time. We have here first, straight from the Acton Institute, Dan Huger. Dan is the librarian and research assistant at Acton Institute. And Dan, if I'm not mistaken, are you not also the host of Acton Line, the podcast?
I am now officially the host of Acton Line podcast. We made a transition back in June to a video podcast, and yeah, I've been doing that once a week since ever since about then.
Awesome. Well, it's good to have you. I didn't see it in your bio, but I was almost certain, like, well, he's hosting a lot of these shows. I should probably introduce him just as the host of Acton Line. So I'm glad it's been official then.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. We have with us, new to the panel, Jen Butler from the State Policy Network. Jen is the Senior Policy Advisor for the Center for Practical Federalism, the aptly named Center for Practical Federalism, which is if I'm not mistaken, a division or subset within the larger State Policy Network. Is that correct?
Excellent. Yes, we launched it about 2 years ago to bring federalism to the state leaders. So this is a great conversation to be a part of.
Awesome, and we're very happy to have you. Last and certainly not least to the conversation is my good friend, no stranger to the podcast, Brooke Medina. Brooke is relatively new to State Policy Network, Vice President of Communications, formerly with the John Locke Foundation, and perhaps most importantly, formerly one of my fellow co-hosts on the tragically defunct Are We Right podcast.
Yes, I am glad to be back in this orbit, Josh. Thank you for inviting me. But yeah, maybe throughout this conversation, we have discussions about revamping Are We Right podcast. But in the meantime, everybody can go check it out in iTunes in its archive form.
There's still a pretty good backlog that people can go check out. A lot of those are still very timely issues. But speaking of timely issues, federalism, I think it's something that's been a hobby horse of mine for many years, but I think it just seems like every year it becomes more and more important and less taken seriously. And I want to start with possibly the low-hanging fruit, which is a sort of let's do some ground setting here, right? What is federalism? And I want to ask this of each of you from two different perspectives. The first is the very practical, what is federalism? But the second is, what I'm going to define is what is federalism of the heart? What does it mean? Because I think your average listener obviously can't actually have a very significant impact on the mechanisms of the federal or state governments or local governments, but they can have an impact on the way in which they think about how we live in political society. So what would it look like, I guess, to have a sort of a spirit, if you would, of federalism among the general populace?
That's an excellent question. I think that I'd be curious to hear what Dan and Jen's takes are on this. And it's provocative to ask what a federalism of the heart is. I think just from a very nuts and bolts practical perspective, federalism is really defined and outlined in the 10th Amendment of our U.S. Constitution about those rights that are not explicitly spelled out as responsibilities of the federal government belong to the states. And that gets at that next question of what is federalism of the heart? And that has to do with the fact that people are born to live in community. They're not, the government is a sort of outside of the natural order of things institution that was set up by people to ensure that we're able to engage in society. But before that, it's about community. And so when we're thinking about how people are created and mankind is created, we're communal creatures and beings, and that should and best happens at the local level. And so our posture is heart-wise ordered toward those nearest to us. Burke called that our little platoons. And so that's my initial thought on it, but love to hear from Jen and Dan on this.
I'm sure that's all you, Brooke, but I don't know if you're evoking Burke's name so soon in the conversation because you're on a Saving Elephants podcast, but I'll get you some brownie points for getting just a few minutes in, getting Burke's name out there.
So I do have a simple question from getting at the federalism of the heart. I think everybody has to ask themselves, who do they want to make decisions and control key things that impact your family, your children, your parents' lives? Do you want somebody in Washington, D.C., some faceless bureaucrat that are making key decisions, controlling key programs, controlling how money is sent and how tax money is spent? Or would you rather have it with somebody that's in your city council, in your state legislature, on your county commission, right? We know that people in our own communities are best positioned to make decisions about the programs that impact you. So, getting back to what Brooke mentioned about the Constitution, really federalism isn't about who has the power. It's about how the power is divided and checked, right? And so it's not necessarily about states having power. It's about the power needs to go back to the people, right? It is about people. Who is best positioned to make decisions that impact your life?
So I would think about this in a way that federalism reflects a deep reality in human community, that there's a genuine social pluralism. The lives that we live are lives in which we have different vocations in the world, and we have different rights and relationships with different authorities in the world. We have a federal government, and I am just as much an American as I am a Roman Catholic, as I am a citizen of the great state of Michigan, as I am a resident of the city of Grand Rapids. None of these is better or worse than the other. They are all part of the social fabric of our lives, and they all have legitimate roles in furthering the common good for all people. So I think one of the things, and if you look at historically how things like federalism arise, you have, part of the history of sort of the West is plural sets of institutions, of church, of state, of families, often living side by side and shaping the lives of everyone. And it's that friction and that space between those jurisdictions that creates the sort of amazing tradition of freedom and prosperity that we've seen in the West. And that social pluralism is something that is part and parcel of what it means to be a part of our civilization, and the greatest aspects of sort of Western civilization, American civilization, and our down and dirty community life.
I think there's a lot to chew on there, and thank you guys for that. I do want to add a fourth voice to the conversation, which is from his most excellent book, American Covenant, Yuval Levin. It's redundant to say his most excellent book. They're all excellent, Yuval Levin's books. But he's writing here about federalism, and I'll read it briefly. He says, federalism is not localism, and it is not subsidiarity, a vital concept from Catholic social thought that contends the power should be kept as close to the people it touches as reasonably possible. Because American federalism leaves most governing authority in the hands of the states, it can often point in the same direction as subsidiarity. But at the heart of federalism is a separation of authorities rather than a layering of them. The national government does not quite support or encircle the states. It does not stand above them on most occasions, but beside them. It acts on the people directly, just as the states do, but regarding different public concerns. Now, I do want to have a broader conversation about subsidiarity here in a moment. We'll get to that, but I'm curious there because my own I'll say dumbed down version of that. It kind of makes sense to me. Okay, who should control the military? Probably the United States government. Who should be responsible for my streets and roads? Probably my more local form of government. It makes sense to me, and I think probably to most people, that what we're talking about here is something that, depending on scale, it would make sense that you would do it at a federal, a state, or a local level. That being said, is that a definition you would quibble with? Is that something you would add to, or is that does that clarify or confuse, say, our understanding of what is federalism, to say that it's actually the federal government and the states, not as one on top of the other, but side by side, doing different things?
I think it's gotten so disordered. I think that's the ideal, what Yuval's getting at, and what Jen even said, where it's not that they should pair well together, and it's a matter of order and domain. I mean, we see this in other areas of our life where different people serve different function. It's not hierarchical at all. It's just a matter of capacities and function and form. And so I think that what he's getting at is the ideal, but you just look around and you look at the nature of how Washington has operated for decades, and you see how unhealthy that relationship has become. And so if this is the ideal state and federal, if we're just talking federalism, it's now looking like this, and it has for a long time. And that power from Washington and the ways Jen can speak about this, and I'm sure Dan can too, where there are just so many interventions because of the federal dollars flowing down to the states that have required states to become subservient to the federal government in ways that they were never constitutionally designed to do.
So
I think our oh, please go ahead.
Oh, I think Brooke's points are very well taken. I hazard to do this because I don't like to quibble with Yuval Levin, but I think
very
that
wise to not do so.
Yeah, but I think that definition of subsidiarity, while true, can also potentially be misleading, because it's not about social arrangements that everything should be handled at the lowest possible level. It is about giving various institutions in society the space to exercise their God-given offices. This means sometimes when some institutions fail, subsidium, which is what this is from, is actually help. So it is an injunction to give that space, but it's also an injunction for higher authorities, and we don't mean higher in terms of worth, but just in terms of, if you had a family, where there was a case of abuse or neglect, it would not be a violation of subsidiarity for Child Protective Services to remove a child who is in danger from their home. It's not, families can be dysfunctional. State governments can certainly be dysfunctional. Federal governments can be dysfunctional. The IMF doesn't violate subsidiarity when it applies conditions to nations that have bankrupted themselves for aid to sort of economically redevelop. And it's important to keep that in mind, that it's not simply just the lowest possible level, but it is what is the rightful jurisdiction and vocation of that particular element of society, that particular sphere of society. And then also, is it able, if it's not able to perform its proper functions, then other elements of society need to fill that gap, but to not absorb those other elements into themselves while they're doing it. So it's a razor's edge sort of thing.
I'd love to bring a practical kind of maybe thought exercise to this, because I am with the Center for Practical Federalism here. We're just on the tail end of our country's longest federal government shutdown. And I think it's interesting just to see what the ripple effect was on everyday Americans, on our most vulnerable across the country, and on states. So for the first couple of weeks that the federal government was shut down, maybe the first week and a half, I live in DC, it was a big deal, right? Individuals weren't getting their paycheck. That was all the chatter. Are you essential? Are you non-essential? But as the days and weeks went by, then we started seeing, okay, how does this ripple out to states? And as Brooke kind of mentioned, the order of federal and state engagement has gotten all jumbled. States have basically become program administrators for federal programs that really should be handled at the state level and make decisions about the state level. So as weeks went by, you had Head Start offices, right? Those are federally funded, federally taxpayer money that goes to the states, and then they operate basically kind of like early childhood programs, education programs for kids 5 and under. Those started closing down. At the beginning of this month, USDA announced that no more money was going to go to states for SNAP benefits, for WIC benefits. So states were left scrambling, trying to figure out, okay, are we going to do an emergency appropriation to create some bridge funding? Some states did, some states did not. But I guess the question I have for you and kind of like the general audience is, why are critical programs, however we feel about these programs, right or wrong, maybe they've kind of gotten bloated or have changed and there's folks on there that shouldn't be on there, but why are these programs that are supposed to be serving the least of us basically contingent on Washington, D.C. getting their act together? Federal government doesn't have to have a balanced budget. States do. So states are just continuously left in the lurch by relying on the federal government to be up and operating when we know they're increasingly becoming more dysfunctional.
Yeah. And on that note of what Jen's talking about there, I mean, to that point, because of the focus that needs to happen at the state level, but how slowed down that has become because of the dysfunction in DC. We see this even in the electoral politics. So there's the bureaucratic side, which Jen is getting at there with the Head Start program, WIC, Medicaid, all of that. But even when you think about the public interest and our, I would say, disordered loves or disordered attention when it comes to the relevance of state and local government compared to what everybody focuses on, which is the theater that comes out of DC. It's like there just isn't even, people don't know who their congressman or congresswoman are, or they don't know who their mayor is. And it's because of this sort of dysfunction at the DC level. It's interesting, it's entertaining, but also because DC is so powerful and has far too much authority and say over what happens at the state level, it has caused the public and the voter to pay far more attention to that than they are, noticing who their commissioners are.
One of those things where I think it's very important that, when Jen pointed this out, is when these government functions are absorbed, whether they be sort of law enforcement functions, whether they be social services provision, it absorbs these subsidiary elements of society and crowds them out. And it crowds them out not only at the levels of like state and local government, but at the level of nonprofits and civil society. A lot of this funding, it affected state budgets, of course. It also affected groups like Catholic Charities. It affected all sorts of sort of civil society groups that have come to depend on federal funds to do their work. And that's very, very troubling when it does that. And it also, creates, I think maybe at the core of this problem is the fact that, the federal government has the ability to take on debt. As Jen alluded to, the states don't have that same sort of leverage that the federal government has to take on debt to fund these programs. And it also doesn't have the sort of, while it has many of the same taxation powers, it doesn't exercise them as robustly as the federal government does. And it can't, because the tax burden on those citizens, they can only get by in the world with, so much being taken by state and local government. And so the federal government crowds that out on that end too, not only in absorbing the duties, but in its extension of taxation and debt prerogatives.
I just
So
go
ahead, Jen.
I was going to tag on just really quickly. I always like to remind folks when I'm talking to them about kind of this federal state dynamic. A lot of times states are complicit in this. They actually like not having to be in the driver's seat. And it's almost like this unspoken kind of agreement that, oh no, we can't do that. The Fed's requiring us to do X, Y, Z. And so I want to make sure folks understand that there is a lot of power. States do have the ability to push back on the feds. It's not a situation of them, the federal government absorbing things. A lot of times they are incentivized to agree to that absorption.
My challenge here is this conversation, which is both excellent, is going in two divergent directions. I am super tempted, Dan, to double down on the subsidiary talk, which I'll circle back to here in a minute. That's why I wanted my Roman Catholic friend on the show, because I figured you could talk to that far more authoritatively and defend it vigorously, which you have. But to Jen's point, practical is the way to go, I think, in a lot of this conversation. And I wanted to bring up some, I don't know if it's fair to call them common, but maybe not even arguments against a federalist model or a reinvigoration of state power, but sort of practical hurdles to get there. And we're kind of talking about it now, the capacity of the federal government to generate debt in a manner that states cannot, or at least cannot without far more immediate consequences. This seems to me not an impossible, but an extremely difficult hurdle to overcome. Like at a 1,000-foot view, how do you actually change a situation in which we get the government we're truly paying for, right? If tomorrow we were to decide, okay, what if all benefits, and I know that nobody seems to be arguing this except for the most hardcore libertarians, right? But what if all benefits were directed just to local governments or states? What if Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, things of that nature? I literally don't know how we would do that because we're living on borrowed time anyways. We're funding these things via debt. Now that's, I know what we're talking about with SNAP's benefits and other more local programs. Maybe there's more practical ways to get through that. But how much of our inability, to wrangle debt at a national level prevents us from truly embracing a federalist reform?
I mean, I think what you really need is, and you often get press reporting on, government austerity, but you really need sustained austerity from the federal government in order to not only, you need to stop providing these services in order for states to start. As long as they are crowding out, nobody's going to win that competition when you are fighting, the government of the largest economy in the world that has, that is the world's, that holds the keys to the world's reserve currency, that has, an impressive sort of taxing authority. And you're just not going to be able to do it until the federal government pulls back. Now, that's an extremely unpopular, very costly thing to do. And, Jen talked about state legislators wanting to pass the buck and sort of welcome federal intervention. Congressmen and congresswomen very much welcome not having to make these sorts of decisions and to just pass continuing resolutions and let the president arbitrarily raise taxes and tariffs according to sort of dubious models as to, using that as an element to repay the debt. And I don't think, unless you get an assertive Congress that is committed to reducing spending and reducing the responsibilities of the federal government, I don't see any other way that you give the other elements of both civil society and state and local governments the room to expand, to carry on these additional responsibilities. As long as somebody else is doing it, they're just not going to.
Yeah, 1000%, right? Not just an assertive Congress, a Congress that really doesn't care about getting reelected, because a lot of these things that we're talking about are third rails. I mean, we've got a ticking time bomb on our hand. Social Security Trust Fund is set to be insolvent in 2034. That's 10 years. That's kind of like when I'm about ready to hit retirement. We saw the exercise that Congress just went through with signing the One Big Beautiful Bill. And so for what that folks that weren't following it as closely as I was in the thick of it, it had significant entitlement reform in there, significant reforms to Medicaid and to SNAP, expanded work requirements to get people back to where they need to be and make these programs truly temporary. But to get there was extremely hard, and implementing that is going to be extremely hard, not even just from a process standpoint and making sure you've got the right implementation legislation at the state level, but from a political standpoint and political cover. So I think a lot of this is just, we are either going to be sitting back and doing things as we have been doing and then be hit with a huge fiscal inflection point even before 2034. I mean, if something happens with China invading Taiwan, I mean, there's a series of black swan events that could happen that will send us kind of upend. And hopefully we are going to have the right leaders in place that won't care about their next reelection cycle, but do what's right for the country.
Yeah. And thinking about what can happen at the state level to push back against what is happening in Washington, because the states do still have power, but they have to they have to actually work for it, right? And start, they're going uphill in a lot of ways. But what we're seeing at the Center for Practical Federalism that I'm so encouraged by, and I hope listeners take this away and leave encouraged as well, is that some of our state lawmakers and other elected officials are exerting more authority, and they are working with the center, for example, and some of our partners to work on legislation at the state level that does demand oversight of federal funds once they come into the state orbit, to make sure that those are accounted for and that they're used properly. So a lot of this is a money game, and it has to do with what sort of strings are attached from the federal government. Do we accept that money if the federal government attaches too many strings to it? And is it politically feasible for us to sustain sort of the onslaught of maybe the Healthcare Association and others who are take the Medicaid example, for example, is there enough political will at the state level to really push back on these things and make sure that lawmakers and other electeds are actually standing up for the taxpayers at the state level? So what CPF's work has been doing has been to highlight those federalism heroes, is what we're calling them, who are actually pushing back against the federal government and holding them accountable. Some ways we've seen this has been a representative out of Oregon, a very, very progressive Oregon, Representative Yunker, and Jen and her team have been working fabulously to help make sure that that story isn't repeated elsewhere. But it was a Medicaid program funded by federal dollars going into Oregon, where the Oregon Health and Human Services was then turning around, giving those dollars to vendors who were then taking and mentally disabled or delayed adults to strip clubs using taxpayer dollars. And so it was preying on the most vulnerable people, and there was not accountability until Representative Yunker and others started pushing for that. And so it takes courageous lawmakers and other elected officials to push back against this, and it's possible, but you need more of those. And so that's one of the things that we've been working on, is making sure that those folks have the encouragement and the resources and tools they need to be able to stand up to the feds and sometimes their own state's health and human services departments.
I think there, that often guest on Saving Elephants, Jeff Mayhew, talks about learned helplessness, sort of cultural or nationwide learned helplessness. We fall in these loops of just assuming these things could never be. But I do think you can begin to see the seeds of reform, even though it's difficult. Even as all of you are talking about the necessity of the national government getting its act together, my heart's just almost sinking. Like, what are the odds that's actually going to happen by 2024? But it could, and certainly we, the people, could demand better representation. I do, however, want to approach that problem backwards, which is something else that, and I don't know, maybe this is just something I think about from time to time. I don't know how much a concern it is for you guys. But if we're talking about reinvigorating federalism, taking serious the giving back to states and local governments their authorities, their abilities, I'm thinking here from my perspective. My day job is I work with the state of Oklahoma in the state auditor's office. I do mostly quality assurance, but I do, of course, get to hear a lot of the juicy details of the crazy stories that go on in local governments. It wasn't that long ago, a reporter in a county courthouse left the county courthouse room and deliberately left a recording device on, thinking they could get some juicy details, which they did. One of the county commissioners and the district attorney were openly talking about hiring a hitman to murder the reporter. There was a county sheriff, not nearly as awful a story, but just sort of demonstrates the kind of people we're talking about. Sometimes a county sheriff, we asked him to sign a document, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his badge, looked at it, and then put it back in his pocket. And the only thing it said was his name and sheriff. And as the manager said, I think he knew how to spell his name. I think it was the word sheriff he's having a hard time with. Now, let me be clear. There's a lot of very bright, wonderful people that work in local and state government in Oklahoma and all over the country. I'm not saying that's indicative of everybody. But I do think that sometimes we suffer from a sense of, well, wait a minute. If the professional bureaucrats aren't doing this job, we're going to turn it over to these yahoos? Like, really? Those are the people that's going to get their act together? And I wonder sometimes if it's a matter of lost muscle memory, right? There's so many decades or generations you can go through where the states, local governments are no longer doing these functions, that we don't elect individuals who see people accountable that can do them. So I guess I'm just wondering, can we speak to that? Is there a sense in which we're talking about a broader problem than just the U.S. government getting its act together, but sort of a failure of leadership all the way down?
I think that's right. And I think that's, so part of this is how do you develop a vibrant civic life where you've seen a decline in local media, so there's a lot of local accountability and pressure that used to be there that is no longer there. You get an increasingly polarized politics where people get a letter behind their name and all of a sudden the argument's made for them. And they don't have to do these sort of nuts and bolts politicking. I was reminded, I mean, you see this very much in my congressional district. My congressional district was the congressional district of Jerry Ford, and then after him for many years of Paul Henry. And these were very much consensus politicians that their goal was to get between 60 and 70% of the vote in their district to get in. And they would do that. And they did that not by being the most conservative Republicans they could be, but by listening to their constituents, by trying to serve the public interest, and by cultivating really good relationships with people in their communities. And you don't see that anymore. The game now is to get that 50+1. And in that sort of environment, you're not rewarding that sort of, you're looking to not build up civic participation, but to sort of degrade it to its lowest common denominator. And you're not really focused on winning for your constituents so much as winning for your constituency. And I think that's a very deep-seated problem.
Yeah, I think also, this gets back to a biblical example of, the people of Israel wanting a king. And so they demanded a king, and, gosh, God said, there you go. How you like that king? And it gets at where I would say the American public's hearts are. And it's like, we get the capitalism we deserve. We get the type of leaders we deserve. And this does get at more of, I'm not into, individual shaming, because some of this is just a failure of leadership, but also it is incumbent upon us to demand better and expect better. But we like the bread and circuses in a lot of ways, we being the electorate. And so there is that component, but there's also a component of fear that happens that drives the headlines, and it drives a lot of people's voting decisions. And so sometimes the people that are right for leadership in times of turmoil and peril, they are not often the ones that are going to speak in that sort of fear-mongering or scary language, and they're usually clear-eyed, and that does not get headlines. That does not often move people in the way that a fear-mongering type of candidate who wants to do all the scare tactics will. And so I think that's part of it too, is just there's that the widespread democratization of information and how we access it, and our appetite for the type of leader that gets that sort of dopamine hit going in us is not always conducive to the same type of leader that is clear-eyed, that would be a good principled statesman or stateswoman. So, we could boil the ocean all day and talk about how to fix that. And I think really it's going to just boil down to individual communities starting to demand better. So that does happen at that very local level, first and foremost, I think. But that's part of the problem too, I'd say.
Yeah. You mentioned, like, how would we hand over power to these yahoos in our backyard? And sounds like you got some interesting things going on in Oklahoma. I think if you're on social media, just, even just for 10 minutes, seeing what Congress is doing, there's yahoos in Congress, unfortunately. I mean, it's just human nature. but there's some serious, thoughtful people there that I'm hoping going into this next year, right? This year, as we're celebrating our country's 250th anniversary, that we really step back and think about what does this American experiment mean, right? And whatever role you serve in your community, whether you're elected or even just raising your family, what does it mean to be part of America and your responsibilities to this country and to the future of it? Something I've been pondering about. Don't have necessarily the answers, other than I'm hoping that this will be a moment. The other thing too, just to get back on a very practical example to maybe illustrate where you had a lot of expertise, centered in Washington, but it started to be distributed in the states, is in environmental policy. So in the early 1970s, when the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, was stood up at the federal level in response to just really bad environmental conditions throughout the country, there might have been one or two state that had some sort of environmental protection agency responsible for, clean air, clean water. Over the years, as DC has built up the EPA, and it is huge. If you've ever been in DC, like the offices of the EPA are just blocks and blocks, humongous, like lots of people in there. But states have begun had to then stand up their own EPA. And I forget the stats right now, but I mean, if you take the collective budgets of state EPAs, I mean, they are in the billions of dollars. So you're starting to get expertise like built in the states. And, we've been talking about from Center for Practical Federalism is that we want to always remind folks in DC, there are states, there's state experts. These federal folks talk to the state folks. We need to be looking for these bridges to begin carving things out that the feds take care of and handing it over to the state, almost like a baton, right, in a relay race, handing it on over that they can take it with and run with it, because that expertise has been built up over the last several decades.
So let me, and you mentioned in the EPA, kind of reminded me maybe a good example of this, Jen. By the way, I appreciate that you're always here with a practical response, as I would expect nonetheless from the Center for Practical Federalism. Maybe the only other critique off the top of my head I could think of federalism, or of this idea of taking federalism serious, comes from our friends on the left, who will often listen to these arguments and grant a lot of the argument. But at the end of the day say, look, I cannot abide this idea that if we were to turn all this power over to the states and relinquish it from the federal government, what about those states that don't play ball? What about this? What if the state of Oklahoma says, you know what, maybe SNAPs isn't necessary? What about the state of Texas that says, you know what, maybe we value our economic prosperity above any environmental concern? How do we, and I'm asking this from the angle of not so much whether we do or do not agree with that critique, but it would seem to me that if we're going to actually have a reinvigoration of federalism, we're going to have to find a way to reach our friends on the left and express this in a way that they too see value in it, that they too see, okay, I understand, even though we may not agree on all things, I can see why working toward this is actually in both of our best interest. There's way too much about our politics as a winner's take all. It all has to be, my side gets everything at once and your side gets nothing. How do you respond to an individual who says, look, it sounds like if you're talking about federalism, what we're really talking about is people are going to be hurting because we can no longer control things at a central national location, and I just can't abide that. That seems immoral to me.
I think one of the ways you could reassure folks like this is to just reassure them that federalism is not our highest political end. That there are certainly times in this nation's history, we think about Civil War and Reconstruction, we think about the Civil Rights era, where human liberty itself was at odds with a principle of federalism. And I'm very comfortable saying that human dignity trumps federalism. That if there is a state that violates human dignity, that fails to render justice to its people, that I don't have problems with, and this gets into sort of Catholic social teaching and subsidiarity, with some other order in society, be it the federal government or civil society, pushing back on states in order to render help, and to guarantee the dignity of persons. And I think you need to make an argument that, federalism is really, really important because it is a genuine expression of social pluralism. And of course, like all elements of society, state governments, local governments can become corrupt, can need correction, can need aid. And that, you make the case, and you don't make the case that, this is an absolutist states' rights argument, but rather that for all of the sort of things that we talk about civil society and all of the good things in human private life, properly functioning local authorities enhance the common good. And yes, there are circumstances where that is abused and where that might need to be corrected, but we'll take those on a case-by-case basis. But that our default position should be some deference to local authorities, because they have their own vocation in the world and they have their own contributions to be made to the common good, and they're being crowded out now and they're not able to make those contributions. And we shouldn't let the fear of their potential abuse lead everything to be absorbed, and we'd all of society to be sort of absorbed into the federal state.
Yeah. I do have some good news on this front. You're asking, like, how do we reach out to, friends on the left that might be concerned about, everybody becoming Texas. So one of the first projects that we undertook at Center for Practical Federalism was outlining just a list of policies, and Brooke touched upon a few of them, like oversight, contingency planning that states should undertake before they accept federal funds. What happens if that money goes away? So we've got a list of policies that we believe contribute to states having the rules of engagement, proper rules of engagement with the federal government. At the end of the day, they might decide to take all the money from the federal government, right? Like any program, but at least they have a process in place to review, to make sure elected officials are making that decision, that there's some sort of oversight and transparency. So we created a scorecard. It's at federalismscorecard.com, where we created some weights. These are kind of arbitrary weights that we put on these policies. And we thought, all the red states are going to be, the top 10, the top half. Then we'll see all the blue states at the bottom. Interesting enough, we have several, what you would say, kind of liberal states that are in the top 10, including Oregon. Oregon has some really great policies in place. Before they accept any federal grant, the legislature has to review it. Now, are they reviewing it from ways that I would look at from taking the money or not? No, I mean, they're applying their own set of principles and priorities, right, that the electorate wants, to those decisions. But I get back to then, practical federalism is not a Republican or a Democrat idea. To me, it's a common sense idea about what sort of oversight do you want to have, who makes these decisions, and what should the rules of the game be, and what ways you engage with the federal government.
One thing I'll note on this topic too, I think Dan and Jen got at some great recommendations and examples of, how you would frame this to someone on the left. But I will also just say this: let's just look at migration across state trends in the ways in which Americans are able to exert their preferences, whether they are left or right. We hear at every presidential election, if so-and-so is elected, I'm moving here. If so-and-so is elected, I'm moving there. I'm sure Canada, which is the 51st state, I will contend one day, is receiving a lot of them right now. But I think that's another benefit to how we have changed as a country and allowed there to be more liberty of movement, and it's been easier to move. I know things are expensive, but people can remote work from wherever. And so there's a lot of opportunities for us to see how this plays out, whether someone wants to now move to New York City because Mom Donnie is there, or they want to move out of that. And so I think that is something that should be encouraging to those on the left and the right, is you don't have to stay where you're at. Now, that's unfortunate. I know someone who is a fourth generation Oregonian and had to end up moving to Texas because of the unfortunate nature of those policies and the impact that had on their family. And so I think that's another sign of, where it's an indication of which states are actually healthy and a benefit to their folks and which ones aren't. So let's just look at the migration patterns.
Yeah. And there's also the beauty of, right, these laboratories of democracy. I love the idea of Vermont experimenting with single payer healthcare. Spoiler alert, it ended up kind of being abysmal and a flop. But there's a beauty of that experimentation, right, contained in a state before it is then unleashed to the rest of the country. So to be able to then have like California have extremely liberal policies, that is great for California. And I know not everybody is going to be able to move, but just the fact that you do have these laboratories of democracy based on the electorate, right, and the people, and then the history of those states is what makes America just so unique.
I'm thinking here that I could have had an entirely separate 1 hour conversation probably with Dan about subsidiarity, because I did mention I want to return to that. And Brooke and Jen, if you guys have any thoughts, I am more than happy to have you chime in. But I wanted to give you a chance, Dan, in case you're chomping at the bits here. I'm an ignorant Protestant. Can you help me understand, not so much that, well, I guess I'm asking about the origin of the idea. Is subsidiarity something that originates within Catholic theological teaching that eventually disseminates into the civil society and politics? Do they go hand in hand? Or maybe related to that, how does it get assumed into American culture? Because is it sort of an outgrowth of Catholicism that our founders embraced, or is it just coincidental and kind of after the fact of federalism, it was a happy coincidence that these things sort of worked together?
Oh, this is a fantastic question. And you can see the origins of this. I was thinking about this. You can see the origins of this with Moses in the desert. And you literally have, at some point, everyone is coming to Moses to resolve their problems, because he is the lawgiver who is, given the law, and now he has to adjudicate all of this. And he very quickly becomes overwhelmed with this, because there's a lot of folks wandering in the desert, and and he receives some sage advice of, you put certain numbers of people over certain numbers of people to adjudicate this thing. So there's a biblical tradition of this. There is also a tradition of this in the history of the early church. So when the church itself is established, it is a minor sort of sect in Judaism. And it is very quickly persecuted by Roman authorities. And so they have to develop a parallel set of institutions to cope with that persecution. And then when Christianity is formally legalized and then made the sort of established church of the Roman Empire, you find bishops adjudicating by the canon law disputes that we would normally think, like property disputes, the sort of things that we would never dream of taking to the church. People took to the church because the ancient world's just very different than the modern world. As the Roman Empire breaks down, this becomes a continuing trend, and you have these parallel institutions of common law, of canon law, that all of this is in the mix. We don't really get anything like our modern states until the early modern period, in early modern Europe. In Spain is where I would put this development. So there's this rich medieval tradition that is also, because this is the western half of the Roman Empire that disintegrates, this is sort of Catholic tradition. But this is something that's inherited by the churches of the Reformation, this historical legacy, this background. You have, in the Lutheran tradition, you get talk about the three estates. You have later folks in the Reformed tradition like Abraham Kuyper will talk about social spheres, taking some categories from German idealism, synthesizing them with Protestant theology. And all of this is happening at the same time. When this gets formalized in the Catholic Church, is really the modern sort of Catholic social teaching begins with Rerum Novarum. In the late 19th century, we have modern nation states. We have sort of the French Revolution. We have the rise of democracy. We have industrialization. We have all of these new challenges. And Pope Leo XIII sets about trying to sort of think through anew how to deal with those in the modern world, taking that historical legacy of the church, taking that earlier biblical tradition, taking all of that and trying to synthesize it. And this brings us up to sort of like the present day. If anybody wants the book, the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Catholic Church is like the big book. This was earlier this century, which compiles a lot of these sources and talks about these things. And in it, it talks about the sort of four permanent principles of Catholic social teaching. One is, and the most preeminent is the dignity of the human person, which is the foundation of sort of how we should think about society. As we should think about individuals being in the image of God, having a sort of mandate to create, to flourish, to develop families. And then as a result, there's a responsibility of social institutions to allow people to make that happen. That's what we sometimes call the common good, is sort of the sum total of conditions that allow people. That's number two. Principle number two derives from that. And then there's subsidiarity, which is the principle that promotes all these intermediate groups that are necessary for an organic society to flourish. Families, associations, local communities, local governments. The church itself is part of civil society and has certain duties and obligations and thus rights to participate in that society. And then all of that comes together in sort of solidarity between not only individuals in a society in a sort of universal brotherhood sense, but also in sort of a recognition of the interdependence of all these institutions that make up civil society, and that's where all of this sort of comes together, and that's sort of the basic outline of Catholic social teaching and how subsidiarity is one of those four core principles. And that language of subsidiarity is one that really starts being formalized in the sense that we think about it today, beginning in the late 19th century and then continues through the Church's social teaching to today.
Wow. Thank you for condensing 2,000 years of theology and political Catholic thought into just a handful of minutes. That's awesome. Like I said, I probably should have made that a separate 1 hour off panel discussion with you at some point, but thank you. There's a lot we could dig into there. By the way, this just popped into my head. I'm pretty sure that when I introduced you, I mentioned you were the research assistant. You're not. You're the research associate, which is kind of the, it's like the difference between the regional manager or the assistant to the regional manager. So my apologies for downgrading you there.
Oh, I am simply a humble servant of all.
Well, you obviously know your stuff, and Brooke and Jen, if you wanted to add anything to that, I by all means would invite you to do so. But since we're running low on time, I also want to give each individual an opportunity for closing thoughts about this broader federalism conversation. And if you want to add to it subsidiary thoughts, that's quite all right. But run low on time. I want to give everybody a chance to say their piece if you feel like there's some important part we've just not covered in this subject.
Quickly on the subsidiarity thought, I think that it is worth, you should do another show on this, Josh. And it's worth examining that in light of all of the things in the turmoil that were happening during the 20th century. And you think about some of the economists like Hayek, who had a man on the spot when they wrote about knowledge and society in their own sort of maybe more secular version of this, but it is rooted in the church's understanding. I'm not Catholic, but in the church broadly understanding of who is best to make these decisions and help their community. So I think that's worthy endeavor, but also overlaying that with some of the political and geopolitical upheaval of the 20th century would be fascinating to discuss. And I'll just say, when I think about why we do what we do and why federalism really does matter, it gets at the heart of who we are as individuals. And I'll finish where I started, which is that we're communal creatures and we are meant to live in community and take care of one another. And so when we have too many people that are far too distant, loving our neighbors on our behalf, but not doing it as well, then we really are not loving our neighbors well. And so it's important for us to defend the rights of communities to be able to step up to the plate and take care of those who are most vulnerable. And so I'm excited about the work that Acton does to help people think about this thoughtfully, but also about the Center for Practical Federalism and State Policy Network, and how we're trying to really make sure that state leaders are empowered and equipped to be able to do what they need to do on behalf of their constituents so that people can live better lives and they don't have the circus in DC calling all of the shots.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I'll tag on. As a baby Catholic, I was hanging on every word. So I would love I'll be a listener, and I have nothing to add to this subsidiary discussion.
I thought about asking you ahead of time, but it just seemed like such a weird question. Are you Catholic before we start?
I came back home a couple years ago, so it's been a wonderful experience and just such a lot to learn. So yes, please do one. I will be tuning into that one.
Okay.
But just a couple closing thoughts on some of the things I touched upon. I just kind of like pivoting off the shutdown, right? I mean, we're just on the tail end of, as I mentioned before, just our country's longest federal shutdown. We just have to remember that we can't rely, simple as it is Washington, D.C., to keep the lights on. And so federalism ensures that states, local communities are better equipped, better positioned to do that, right? Because it gives them control, decision-making power, whether they choose to use it or not, to keep essential programs running, right? And budgets in check. So it's not just about, the idea of, quote unquote, small government, limited government, right? It's about smarter, closer, hopefully more accountable government. So folks that are tuning in, if you want to learn more about just practically what it means, federalism would mean in your life, you can check out our website at centerforpracticalfederalism.org. We have an online magazine called American Habits that touches upon and does some really great interviews on key issues of the day, and just illustrating why big topics that a lot of times people just think, oh, those are happening in the halls of Congress, like IT, AI, healthcare. Why those should be happening in communities, in your backyards, in your communities, and how decisions like that can be made, by your state and local elected officials, and by you all. The role that your American citizen has in these critical discussions.
So I want to recommend to everybody that you follow these ladies for the policy angle, because I'm not a policy guy, and I'm so thankful that they have been here to talk about the policy stuff. But one of the things, we talked a little bit about subsidiarity, but the American tradition of federalism, I think, is an example of that. But I think it's also a very unique, very powerful, very American institution that is uniquely amazing and great. And people should go back to America's founding documents, read the debates, get immersed in that, where that comes from. Lord Acton gave a lecture on the American Revolution once, and he ended it on this note, describing America. He said, by the development of the principle of federalism, it has produced a community more powerful, more prosperous, more intelligent, and more free than any which the world has seen. And this is from an Englishman in the 19th century. And he saw this sort of secret sauce we had, and he wanted that. He thought it was the envy of the world, and I really think it is.
Excellent note to end on. Dan, Jen, and Brooke, I appreciate all three of you guys. I echo Dan's sentiment. The policy angles, you guys are amazing for that. Dan, I appreciate the deep dive in subsidiarity. I'll have to figure out when we're going to get you back to talk about that in particular. Thank you three for coming on. I appreciate it very much. Thank you everyone for watching this excellent conversation, and we will see you guys next time.
Thank you very much.